Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue au Centre de recherche pour le développement.
Welcome to IDRC. The presentations this morning will be in English, but we have simultaneous interpretation in French. So if you want to use the headsets at the back of the room, please go ahead.
The Development Center is delighted to host this event. For over 40 years, we've been supporting research and researchers in the developing world to find innovative solutions to the complex development problems they face. We're particularly glad this morning to be discussing the issue of jobs and development, one of the most critical development issues of our time, I think. Jobs are critical to the well-being of individuals, families, and nations. A special welcome to our Mexican guests, of course, the research team that is going to present later in the program. And we'd also like to welcome representatives from other official missions here in Canada, including those of Kenya and Sudan. And we're very happy that also a number of colleagues from other government departments are here to join us today, including the Public Service Commission, Human Resources and Skills Development Canada, Finance Canada, Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as many other development organizations. So to provide some opening words for this morning's presentation, I'm going to ask Vaughn Lantz to come to the podium. He is the Director of International Financial Institutions at the Canadian International Development Agency in their Multilateral and Global Programs branch. Thanks, Vaughn.
For development programming to be successful, that's better, it must be well informed. This is why the Canadian International Development Agency supports the research and analysis that the World Bank provides through its World Development Reports. CIDA is pleased to have provided funding for the last 3 World Development Reports on conflict, security and development, gender development, and the report that we're here to discuss today. These reports influence policy decisions that have real impacts on the ground in developing countries. For example, the 2011 report on conflict, security, and development helped to increase financial support to fragile and conflict-affected countries. It endorsed the need for immediate assistance to prevent lapses into violence and fragility, as well as long-term assistance to build legitimate and lasting institutions. And I'm pleased to note that this year, 42 countries and international organizations, including Canada and the World Bank, signed a new deal for engagement in fragile countries. CIDA's mission is to help people living in poverty. One of our key thematic priorities in this regard is sustainable economic growth. Our strategy for programming in this sector focuses on 3 areas. First, building economic foundations. Second, growing businesses. And third, investing in people. The World Development Report on jobs that we're here to discuss today informs CIDA's work in all 3 of these areas. The report finds that quality jobs are critically important for individual well-being, poverty reduction, economy-wide productivity growth, and social cohesion. The report highlights that not only do jobs matter for development, but some types of job creation are more effective at reducing poverty than others. The report also reminds us that each country or local context is unique and that there is no single solution. With this in mind, the report is written to be applied in different country contexts. And I'm eager to hear from Mr. Martinez and his team on the Mexico case study in this regard. One key point that I think we all need to keep in mind with respect to job creation is that jobs need to encourage not only growth, but equity. CIDA is particularly concerned that quality jobs be accessible to all individuals who need them. For example, the report that finds that women's labor force participation varies dramatically across countries, from a high of 77% to a low of 28%. We must ask ourselves, why? And how can we make access to economic opportunities more equitable, not only across the gender divide, as well as rural-urban, ethnic, and other divides. The report and events like this one today will help to inform CIDA's work and its programming and help to ensure that together we can advance our development aims. Thank you again to IDRC for hosting today's event, for our distinguished presenters, and to you for contributing to this event through not only your questions this morning, but through the work that you do in your own careers with respect to development assistance and research. I'm hopeful that today's discussion and that this report will make your work all the more fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vaughn. We're going to move quickly into an overview of the World Bank's World Development Report, and then we're going to continue with the presentation of the case study on Mexico. But we'll start with the overview, and our two presenters are Samuel Freije-Rodriguez. He is a senior economist in the poverty reduction and economic management sector at the World Bank, and he has a PhD in labor economics from Cornell University. And our other presenter is going to be Gordon Betcherman. He is a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, with a cross-appointment in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He holds a PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. And over to the two of you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your attention and your presence. The World Development Report this year takes the title of Jobs, and we basically make this cover of the report to make clear that the request for jobs, the demand for jobs, is something that is global, that is perceived as a serious concern in every society under any language, and that is the main message we want to convey with this cover. Let me give you, in these times of tweets and short messages, a summary, a very brief summary in 8 sentences of what the report is about. What are the main messages of the report is summarized in these very big 4 sentences and the complementary sentences that accompany them. First and foremost, we propose that jobs drive development. We envision and we propose in this report that whatever we care about development happens through jobs. We want not only higher standards of living, we also want productivity, we want female participation, we want urbanization, we want protection of the environment. And all those things, if we think hardly, happen through jobs, through the type of jobs that people hold in a society. Therefore, the corollary of this sentence is that we should not think of jobs as a mere derived demand. For those who are used to the economics literature or to the labor economics literature, labor markets are usually conceived as derived demand, something that happens after you have demand for goods and services. And therefore, we tend to think that jobs come after growth. And we basically try to highlight the idea that jobs should not be thought as just an afterthought of growth, of economic growth. Jobs are actually the main purpose of economic development, and development happens through jobs. So we try to contest somehow the idea that jobs are merely derived demand. The other big issue is that it is not only the number of jobs. Even though the press and the media highlight the problem of unemployment, particularly in developed countries, and particularly among the youth, as high youth unemployment is one of the biggest problems that current modern societies face. In the developing world, most poor people do work, and actually do work long hours. The main problem is not necessarily the number of jobs, but the quality of those jobs, and the productivity of those jobs, and the earnings that are obtained by workers through those jobs. In addition to this, we propose that yes, it's certainly a matter of the quality of jobs, the earnings that those jobs provide to workers and their families. But we also want to highlight a very important idea in this report, and is the idea that some jobs have greater development payoffs. And by development payoffs, we go beyond the idea of earnings, monetary earnings, or even the idea of the benefits, and even non-monetary benefits that that certain jobs entail, but the idea that certain jobs have spillovers on the society, benefits and improvements that the whole society can gain beyond the worker. And this is a central idea in this report. The benefits, the spillovers, all those special characteristics that certain types of jobs provide to the rest of the society and not only to the worker. So it's not only a matter of the number of jobs, it's a matter of the earnings and the quality of those jobs and the spillovers, the social spillovers that certain jobs entail. The third idea, thank you very much. The third idea is that job challenges vary across countries. And this idea of the spillovers is somehow associated to the idea that different societies face different job challenges, and therefore they are in different development stages, they face different developmental characteristics, be it because of their demographics, be it because of the geographic characteristics, institutional characteristics, or economic characteristics. Therefore, these spillovers are different from one country to another, and even within a country, different from one region to another. So one size does not fit all. We cannot provide or recommend single policy recommendations that are applicable to any country or any region in any moment of time. Policy recommendations have to be region or country specific based on the specific job challenges that this country faces or this region faces. So job challenges vary across countries. And finally, labor policies matter less than assumed. Usually the discussion about jobs, the discussion about labor markets, it revolves around issues like employment protection legislation, labor law, the participation of unions, the labor market policies implemented by government. And these issues are important, but in many cases, and particularly in developing countries, perhaps they are not crucial. One of the main approaches of this World Development Report is going beyond a partial equilibrium approach that basically concentrates on the workings and the performance of the labor market and suggests a general equilibrium perspective of the whole economy simultaneously, and tries to give the idea that in certain circumstances, in many cases in developing countries, the main constraints or the main problems are not in the labor market per se. It may be in the capital markets. It may be in terms of infrastructure. It may be in terms of human capital accumulation, how the education system is working. So we basically propose the idea that perhaps job policies are important but are not crucial, are not as important as the heated debate that is associated to them usually implies. The main constraints in developing countries may be beyond labor markets. This is the World Development Report in just 8 short sentences. Let me just try to elaborate. And I'm not trying to not let Gordon explain. He will explain this in full detail. But in a single slide, this is the World Development Report. The job challenges are huge, of course. We just make a small collection of big numbers to highlight attention of the general public about this. 6 million jobs are necessary in the course of 15 years just to keep the same unemployment rates we have now. Not to change, not to reduce unemployment, not to increase labor force participation. Just to keep the situation as is, we need 6 million jobs worldwide. 621 million youth, individuals aged 15 to 24, do not work and do not attend school or have any kind of training. So the youth unemployment problem that is sometimes highlighted is even compounded and made even worse by youth that are not working, but are not studying either, nor getting any kind of training for going to the job market. So the problem is even bigger, but only looking at unemployment may be somehow misleading, because in the developing world, the youth cannot afford to be unemployed, and they are even in a worse situation. They are not even trained, they are not even getting education. The other important issue that we want to highlight in the report is that we want to prevent the general public of thinking of jobs as employment, or the conventional relation that we think of jobs as employer-employee relationships. In the developing world, the world labor force is around 3 billion people. And of those 3 and something billion people in the world, 1.5 billion people work in farming and in self-employment. So this conventional view of an employer and an employee with a regular payment every week or every month and a dependency with labor regulations and a series of structures that define these jobs another reality of almost half the labor force in the world. In the developing world, most of the workers are people who work in small farms for themselves, for providing for their families, or are self-employed. So when we refer to jobs, we refer to tasks, to activities that provide earnings or means of living, not only employment relationships with an employer and an employee. Let me start showing some of the main results of the report, basically the main introduction of our ideas. A job does not always come with a wage, and this varies across the developing world. We have countries like, for instance, in Europe and Central Asia, the developing countries of those areas, where the majority of the workers indeed are wage employees, are people who have a working relationship with an employer. And the minority are these self-employed and farmer workers. But if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa or even East Asia and the Pacific, the relationship, the ratio changes. And the majority of the workers are people working either as self-employed or as farmers in small farms for subsistence. So in the developing world, we have a big heterogeneity in the characteristics of and the functions of workers. But the important thing is that the conventional wage-employee relationships are not the common employment or the common characteristic of workers in the developing world. This slide basically tries to highlight the size of the challenges. We have, for instance, in South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific, the need for creating nearly 12 million, 15 million new jobs every decade in the next 2 decades. That means an amazing amount of jobs. There are countries like China or India that during the last decade and in forthcoming years, even though the demographics are changing, need to create nearly 1 million jobs a month. That is a phenomenal challenge in terms of just the demographics. Just the demographics of these countries creates a very different challenge than countries like in Europe and Central Asia. We, in the report, provide the examples of countries in Europe and Central Asia that do not have this challenge, but exactly the opposite. Their population declines year after year. So the labor market characteristics of countries with a massive youth bulge or countries that have a population decline are completely different. And the type of policies that you have to recommend in terms to sustain a standard of living and provide development have to be completely different. The right-hand side slide highlights what I mentioned before about youth unemployment. These are rates by cohort of unemployment or not attending schools or training. Notice that the tip of those bars is the actual unemployment problem. The biggest size of the problem among the youth in developing countries is not attending school or training or job training. So this is another way of making you think of the peculiar and special characteristics of employment challenges or job challenges in the developing world. It's a massive change in terms of demographics, and the problems of the youth are not necessarily only unemployment, it's mostly human capital accumulation. Let me give you a presentation of the first part of the report, which basically makes a diagnostics. And Gordon will make a presentation about the main thrust of the ideas of the report and our basic policy recommendations. We use the term jobs are transformational as a catchword for the idea that development happens through jobs. And it happens, and let us be very clear about this. We are not saying that growth is not important. There is huge, enormous evidence that growth is accompanied by higher productivity jobs, more social protection, more social insurance. So growth is necessary. Growth is accompanied by better and more quality, better and more jobs. However, our main point is that may not be sufficient, and in certain circumstances, growth does not bring the kind of jobs that you want to have. So first and foremost, yes, growth is important, but we want to go beyond that. And we basically say that jobs provide a sustainment of development in 3 basic pillars: living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. In terms of living standards, we basically mean that jobs are the main explanatory cause not only of monetary living standards, earnings, actual earnings of the individuals, but also non-monetary benefits like health, or both physical health or mental health, and also non-monetary conditions, non-monetary benefits such as we may even talk about happiness or civic engagement or willingness to participate in society. Then the second pillar is productivity, and we, with this, postulate that jobs are the channel through which more productive firms and more productive economies are actually happening. And how this happens is a complex process that involves not only firms, but also workers and the state and other organizations. And in the third pillar, we basically want to go beyond the standard analysis of taking into consideration workers and firms, but also taking into consideration the society as a whole. What are the spillovers that good jobs, high-quality jobs, high-productivity jobs, jobs that allow for families to have a decent standard of living, have also consequences in terms of the social cohesion of a society, of the civic participation, of the tolerance of individuals regarding minorities or other groups. Let me first give you the evidence regarding living standards. We made a summary of the literature, the recent 2 or 3 decades of the literature on poverty dynamics. And this survey of the literature shows us that indeed, in developing countries, job-related events are the main explanatory cause of escaping poverty. What we mean by job-related events is either one member of the family finds a job, or the members of the family who have a job have an earnings raise or have an improvement in the productivity of their jobs. Any kind of these jobs-related events is the most explanatory cause of poverty reductions. And that is something that we see across the world, but mostly in developing countries. In more developed countries, where social security systems and social assistance systems are much more sophisticated and much more evolved, it may be the case that only job-related events are not the most powerful or most common force in reducing poverty. It may be that other mechanisms help people to escape poverty. But in the developing world, where these mechanisms are not well developed, labor markets and labor earnings and the participation of my family members into the labor market is the main force for escaping poverty. Regarding productivity, we made important studies trying to put together data sets, both at the firm level and at the individual level. One of the things that then Gordon will highlight even more is there is an enormous lack of good data for studying what's happening in labor markets in the developing world. If you have a look, for instance, in a country like Chile, which is a high middle-income country, and you check the distribution of firms using a firm survey, or the distribution of firms using a labor force survey, you will find that the distribution of firms and the firm dynamics that you can derive from these two data sources are completely different. So we made an effort to put together these sources and trying to ascertain where is job creation happening. In the large firms, mid-sized firms, small firms, do we have more job creation than job destruction? Is there excessive churning compared to other countries? And when we put together all these two sources of data, the numbers are completely different. And we see that the information that could be driven from firm surveys, which is the large firms are the main explanatory cause for labor churning, we realize, no, it's not the large firm. It's not even the small firms. It's the micro firms where most of the churning is happening in a country like Chile. But very few other countries we can do this kind of experiment. So we really don't know what's happening in many developing countries in terms of job creation, job destruction, and actual churning. And this process is fundamental for productivity enhancement, because this is the process that allows old technologies to disappear from the market and new technologies replace those old technologies, and individuals who are trapped somehow, workers who are trapped somehow in low productivity activities are expelled from those low productivity activities and find high productivity activities. If you don't have this process of job creation, job destruction, it is very difficult to have enhancements of productivity in developing world. So we made this effort in trying to collect information, and we start to have a knowledge about this process of job creation and job destruction in developing countries. But at the same time, we still see that most developing countries have a large, much larger share of the labor force in very, very small firms. And we also provide evidence in the report that the productivity differences, the variance and the dispersion of productivity differences in developing countries is much higher than in developed countries. Why is this? Because somehow this process of creative destruction, of moving workers from low productivity firms to high productivity firms through this process of creative destruction and appropriate churning is somehow stagnated in developing countries. Why How, for how much, what are the main reasons behind this? It's something that is part of a research agenda, but we're basically highlighting the importance of this phenomenon in order to understand how to increase productivity in developing countries. Finally, we also put together some evidence about workers in the developing world and how these workers, depending on whether they have a job or not, whether they have a good quality job or not, they participate in civic engagement activities, be it being member of a political party, participating in elections, being member of civic associations, having trust in their neighbors, having trust in political institutions, having trust in the church. All these type of questions we try to link with the characteristics of the jobs of individuals. And we find preliminary evidence. This is another area where we think, yes, there is some reason to believe that the quality of jobs and the type of jobs that people have are fundamentally associated to civic participation and to trust, which are just two indicators of the idea of social cohesion. Social cohesion is a much more complex idea, but these two main concepts that we took into consideration in order to link to development and to jobs in the developing world, we find some evidence. Actually, there is a nice background study that we made for Indonesia, where we have evidence of individuals being observed after 5 years. And we observed that individuals that previously had a job and continue to have a job have much higher levels of social participation than individuals that had a job 5 years ago and now they don't. And individuals that didn't have a job and now have one have recorded important increases in their civic participation. So we're basically saying this is not something additional or something curious. This is something that may be fundamental, because the ability of a society, through the jobs that the society is able to provide, in order to these jobs help people to participate in the society and resolve the usual conflicts that any society have in a pacific manner, in a civic manner, it's something that is a spillover, a fundamental spillover of jobs as a driver of development. These are the three main blocks that we say are fundamental for diagnostic the characteristics of jobs as drivers of development. Part 2 and Part 3 of the report talk about the main ideas, the original ideas that we propose to the research community and the policymakers in terms of how to promote jobs that drive development, and our policy recommendations. And for that, I leave you with Gordon Betcherman. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So what we've tried to do in the first half of this presentation is essentially set out the challenge that we see developing countries facing in terms of creating jobs, talking about the contribution that jobs can make to development through these three transformations that Sam talked about: living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. What I'm going to do is try to then move a little bit more into so what does it matter, the policy realm of all of this. And although the WDR does not get to the point of giving specific policy prescriptions to country A or country B, what it does do is it tries to present a conceptual framework to guide thinking about how jobs that are good for development can be promoted, especially through the operation of markets and through policy. So we have this concept in the World Development Report that we call good jobs for development. And this is different than good jobs. So the notion, we all know about the notion of good jobs. Those are jobs that give people good incomes, have high levels of protection against risk, allow them to participate in the mainstream of society. Those are good jobs, but we draw a distinction between those jobs and what we call good jobs for development. And good jobs for development is a social concept, is the concept of social value in the way that economists talk about social value as opposed to individual value. So when we talk about good jobs for development, we're talking about jobs that have positive spillovers for the economy and the society in which they operate. And for various reasons, there may be jobs that actually do more for society than other jobs, even though those different jobs may have the same individual value, okay? And what we try to get at through this concept of good jobs for development is that in different contexts, some jobs do more for development than others. And what we have in this, I've taken the same temple, Greek temple that Sam introduced at the beginning of the presentation to show the link with living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. And what we've done is in each of these transformations, we've identified some characteristics of jobs that can have positive spillovers on the societies that they're involved in. And those spillovers can be on the living standards side. So, for example, jobs that empower women, jobs that enable women to participate in the market economy, can in many situations be good jobs for development, not only because of the inclusive nature of bringing women to the workforce, but as many of you know, there's a lot of evidence showing that when women work, when women bring incomes into households, those households tend to invest more in the education of their children, in the quality of their housing, in the health care that the family members have. So there can be broader developmental goals that are met through women becoming active participants in the workforce. Similarly, there are some jobs that have positive spillovers in terms of productivity. Jobs that connect with global markets are an example of that. There's a tremendous transfer of knowledge and know-how as workers and as firms in developing countries get exposed to ideas from around the world. So in some situations, those are jobs that can have an important positive spillover. Similarly, there are jobs that can have positive spillovers in the area of social cohesion. Think about a conflict-affected country that's trying to get back on a positive path, finding jobs that allow young people, young men in particular, to start participating in the social and economic mainstream of the society, can have, certainly they're good for those young men, but by offering alternatives to those young men, they can have broader societal value. So what we try to do in the report is think about what are good jobs for development in different country contexts. And then in the policy part of the report, we think about what policies might encourage the creation of those good jobs for development. So as Sam mentioned, we have a clear view that there's not one size fits all, that good jobs for development and the jobs challenges that countries face really depends on the context. So when you're writing a report like this and you're dealing with 200 plus countries, you need to come up with some kind of typology to think through how you're going to organize your thinking. Often that is done by looking at countries by income level or by region. But what we did in this report was we thought about 8 types of countries that face distinct and unique challenges in terms of creating employment and good jobs for development for their citizens. And some of these types of countries are along the development continuum. So we have agrarian societies, we have urbanizing societies, we have formalizing societies, we have aging societies. That's a continuum, essentially, of countries along a development chain. But we also have country types that are essentially defined by demography. So we have countries that are dealing with very high levels of youth unemployment. We also have countries that are defined by their endowments, resource-rich countries, small island nations, for example. So what we've done, and these aren't mutually exclusive types, in other words, a country can be embodied with characteristics of more than one type, but what we look at are these 8 country types, and we try to identify, first of all, what are good jobs for development in those country contexts. Second of all, what are the obstacles to the creation of those jobs? And then third of all, what kinds of policies might remove or alleviate those obstacles? Now, in the chart here, we've identified the 8 country types, and for each of them, we have some examples of what we consider to be good jobs for development in these country types. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to give you a couple of examples, let me talk about one I already have talked about, conflict-affected countries, where social cohesion is obviously a high priority. So depending on the country's situation, the relative weight of living standards versus productivity versus social cohesion can matter. And there's often trade-offs between the three. You may have development that is good for one, but at the expense of another. In conflict-affected countries, social cohesion obviously matters an awful lot, and jobs that demobilize combatants, reintegrate displaced populations can be jobs that are really important for the development of those countries. Similarly, take countries with high youth unemployment. And here our model was really the North African and Middle Eastern countries. where I think we had a very interesting analysis. A lot of people think that the issue in these countries is especially better education of young people so that they can have the skills that are necessary for a modern economy. Our analysis led us to a demand-side explanation of the problems that young people in the Middle East and North Africa are facing, and that is essentially that these remain economies of privilege without open competition and opportunities for young people to peddle innovative skills. So in these countries where obviously finding productive, meaningful opportunities for young people would be jobs with very high social return, we focus in particular on jobs that help to remove the constraints of economies of privilege, essentially. So this approach of thinking about living standards, productivity, and social cohesion as the key objectives of employment, and B, the notion of social value and not just individual value, can lead you actually to quite different ideas about what the priorities of job creation should be and what the policies should be that can create those jobs. And what I'm going to get to at the end of my part of the talk is the notion that often the most important things that you can do for employment reside outside the labor market. Okay? Very quick word, I don't have time to get into this in detail. In the report, we really do look at jobs challenges and jobs policies at the level of the country. And we talk about these different country contexts. But it's obvious that jobs agendas can be connected because of the interconnections going on in the world today. So jobs agendas of individual countries can very much be affected by the movement of workers. And this is a chart that shows how important emigration and immigration are for different countries. The darker the shade, essentially, the more important migration is. One of the things to take away from this is that despite all of the emphasis and talk about migration, for many countries in the world, it's not a major part of their jobs challenge. But clearly for those countries that have dark shade, either because they're sending lots of workers or they're receiving lots of workers, there is an additional agenda to jobs challenges that has to do with migration. Similarly, jobs are migrating. And what this chart shows is the movement of manufacturing jobs out of high-income countries. And with the migration of jobs, that clearly interconnects jobs agendas of different countries. And there are some very big issues here. Manufacturing jobs have clearly been moving from high-income countries into middle and lower-income countries. There's a big global issue about what's going to happen to the tens of millions of manufacturing jobs in coastal China that appear, that they are going to go somewhere, whether it's farther inland in China or to other countries. So there is clearly migration of employment. That's an important part of the story as well. But let me return now to country-level policies. And what we talk about in the final part of the report is policies through the job lens. And what I mean by that is a three-leveled view of what jobs policies need to include. Okay, and we have this pyramid which essentially summarizes the story here. The first is the fundamentals. So it's clear that private sector growth has been important for the creation of jobs and good jobs. We did a lot of analysis of where jobs have come from, and not surprisingly, over 90% of job growth has been in the private sector. So things like macroeconomic stability, an enabling business environment, all the things you would expect the World Bank to be saying about the context for jobs is in the report. There's no question about it. One thing we do, though, make a lot about in the report as one of the fundamentals is that the protection of workers' rights through the core labor standards, we see that as a fundamental as well. And that's a pretty much of a new thing for the World Bank to be saying so unambiguously. So you need the fundamentals to get the growth that is required for job creation. Growth does not always translate into jobs, so the second layer of this pyramid is also important, and this is what we call labor policies. And as Sam mentioned, often discussions about jobs start and end with labor policies. Is the labor code the right one? Are minimum wages set at the right level? Do social insurance programs create the right amounts of protection and incentives? Are the training programs right? These things can be important, but as Sam mentioned, in most countries that we look at, this is not the most important thing. And we talk about a plateau in this report. And what we mean by that is a zone where, as long as the country's labor institutions and policies are within that zone, and that can be quite a wide zone, labor policies are not going to be either the magic bullet for solving jobs challenges, nor are they going to be the major problem for jobs challenges. If you get off of that zone, though, onto one of the cliffs, that cliff could be because labor regulations are too intrusive, minimum wages are too high, unemployment insurance systems create bad incentives. This is the cliff that labor economists tend to talk about. You can have lots of problems, and we use India as an example of that, actually. But we also talk about the other cliff, and that's the cliff where institutions are not strong enough and policies are not effective enough, where workers don't have voice and where people don't have instruments to help them manage risks in the labor market. So there can be a zone of too much intervention, one cliff, another cliff, essentially institutions that are not strong enough, and you can be in trouble if you're on one of those two cliffs. But we argue that as long as you're on this plateau, the labor market policies themselves are not probably the key instrument. Now let me talk a little bit about the top part of this pyramid, and this is, I think, really where much of the innovation in the report is, and I think a lot of the controversy about the report. This gets back to the concept of good jobs for development that I started with a few minutes ago. What the top of this pyramid talks about are identifying policies that can encourage the creation of these good jobs for development, okay? And what these policies are will differ very much on the country context if you go back to the typology that I showed a few minutes ago. So it may be that, again, in a conflict-affected country, the policies at the top of this pyramid could be programs that create jobs for ex-combatants or get young men into meaningful economic activity. In an urbanizing country like we see so many in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia now, the idea may be policies that start to make cities more functional, or policies that free up the output of export industries to be easily traded worldwide. So it could be infrastructure and ports, it could be transportation. In formalizing countries like Mexico, and we're going to hear much more about this in the next part of the presentation, it may well be social protection policies that broaden the scope of formal risk management instruments. So the nature of what policies would go into this tip vary very much depending on the particular job challenges that the country faces, okay? And as I mentioned, often those policies will not be labor market policies. In urbanizing contexts, it may well be that the most important policies for creating good jobs may be urban policy, maybe infrastructure. In conflict-affected countries, they could be social policies. In the youth unemployment countries I talked about in North Africa, they may well be policies that free up product markets or somehow try to remove anti-competitive practices, okay? So this is our notion of policy through the job lens, and it includes the basics of the fundamentals. It includes labor market policy, but we tend to not think it's the decisive factor in most cases, and it includes this tip of policies that can create good jobs for development. I'm going to skip over this. What I want to spend the last few minutes on is what we think is kind of a different feature of the report, and we call them the difficult questions. So we have 8 difficult questions that policymakers concerned about jobs tend to be asking around the world. And we deal with these questions in spreads that are associated with each chapter. And they tend to be questions that we've heard many times when we're going and speaking to policymakers in different countries who are saying, how do we create more jobs? And they're questions like, let me just go through a few of these. Is it possible to foster entrepreneurship? Everyone knows that microenterprises are the seeds of economic activity, and that getting those microenterprises into small and then medium and large firms is a key to creating jobs. Policymakers say, well, is there anything we can do to foster entrepreneurship? Can policies contribute to social cohesion? What do we do about international competition for jobs? So each of these questions is dealt with in a 4 or 5 page spread, and what we tend to do is start with the conventional wisdom, okay, and explain what that conventional wisdom is. But then what we try to do is show how, using this framework of the WDR, you can come to conclusions that the conventional wisdom, while often correct, is not always correct. And you can find cases where an unconventional approach may, in fact, lead to the best development outcomes. And let me finish by talking about 1 or 2 of these questions, depending on time, because you have 500 font. Yes, okay. 3, okay. One big question is skills or jobs, what comes first? Okay, so you go to many countries, and the conventional wisdom is that if education systems are improved, training systems are strengthened, that countries will make the supply side progress that is going to ultimately generate a highly skilled workforce that will create jobs. And in many cases, this is true. And there's a tremendous literature in economics, of course, that shows that investing in human capital has high economic returns. And many developing countries are taking this human capital message to heart, and we see enormous investments in training, for example. India has committed to training 500 million people over the next 10 years. Turkey has enormous training programs that involve millions of people every year and a significant part of the country's budget. What we try to show in dealing with this question is that in many cases that is the right strategy, but it may not always be the right strategy. And there may be cases, for example, where the problem is actually not skills. It may look like skills in terms of mismatches and skill shortages, but the problem could be that labor markets are sending the wrong signals to education systems, that there are not incentives in the labor market to encourage firms to do certain types of training or workers to acquire certain types of skills. It may be that the really important skills are non-cognitive skills that tend not to be taught in formal training programs. So what we identify are many cases where, in fact, jobs come first and skills will follow. So when you think about Bangladesh, a country that has been relatively successful in terms of urbanizing, getting productivity gains in agriculture that created a lot of surplus labor, many of whom are women, and creating channels for those people to move into cities and to get jobs in ready-made garments and textiles. And there's lots of things about those sectors that are difficult in the Bangladesh concept, but many of those developments have actually been really good for the employment of women, for example, and for a number of social and economic outcomes that have spread from that. And the most important thing for especially these Bangladeshi women to get jobs in these lower value-added urban settings, which hopefully is the first rung in a ladder to bring them into better jobs even, was not necessarily education. Certainly they had to have the most basic level of literacy and numeracy. But the creation of jobs was really the key part of it, through strategies that created ready-made garment and textile sectors that were competitive for export. So at that stage, I would not say that the key constraint to deal with was skills and education. The key constraint was getting functional cities going, creating infrastructure that would allow an export-oriented sector to flourish. So there, the conventional wisdom would not apply. But when we look forward for a country like Bangladesh, for them to move into higher level skills, higher level industries and value added, at that stage, educational skills is going to be very important, and the conventional wisdom is going to be right for that stage of development. So just having the most basic level of skills is not going to do enough for them to get into pharmaceuticals or whatever the next stage of development is going to require this investment in skills. So I encourage you to look at these different questions because it's an attempt to rethink the conventional wisdom and to think about how policy solutions may well differ when you think about things through the framework that we've developed for the World Development Report. You can go on the website and get the report and all kinds of other things. Okay?
Thank you to Sam and Gordon for that very comprehensive and very fascinating overview of this WDR. We're going to move into the Mexican case study in a moment. And I'd just like to say that IDRC's Supporting Inclusive Growth program was very pleased to have funded this case study in collaboration with CIDA. Within the Supporting Inclusive Growth program, we have a number of priorities which really get reflected by supporting this case study. One, to promote a more holistic approach to the challenges of employment and inclusive growth. Secondly, the need to understand local solutions. As was just emphasized, we know that, at least we're finding out from this WDR, the emphasis is that job challenges are country or regional specific, and hence policy recommendations also need to be tailored in that way. And the third area that I'd highlight for our Supporting Inclusive Growth program is that we know that the lessons of Mexico, which is an important partner for Canada, can be significant not just for Mexico, but also to inform other Latin American countries and indeed globally on the challenges of jobs and policy solutions. So we're now going to move into the Mexican case study, and I'm going to very quickly introduce our four presenters who are here today. And I will add that even though I'm going to introduce them quickly, given our time this morning, there is more details of them and also of the Mexican case study on the website of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. So very quickly in the order that they're going to present, Gabriel Martinez. He is currently the Secretary General of the Inter-American Conference for Social Security. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Our second speaker is going to be Nelly Aguilera. Nelly is a senior researcher at the Inter-American Conference for Social Security, and she holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Our third speaker will be Hector Villarreal. He is a founding director of CIEP, a Mexican-based nonprofit research center specialized in public finance and public economics, and he holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And finally, our fourth speaker will be Angel Calderon. Angel is a professor and senior researcher from the Center of Economic Studies of El Colegio de Mexico. He is an economist with a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Thank you, and I now turn it over to our four Mexican presenters. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Given the shortness of time, I'm going to get to the point. The Mexico case study is motivated by the question of why is Social Security coverage so low? Why the country has not been capable of increasing social protection? There are issues, hypotheses. Perhaps there's too much informal economy. Perhaps there are too many small firms with very low productivity. Perhaps social regulations have accentuated these issues. Perhaps the tax system is not doing a good job. And perhaps there are also phenomena of discrimination, of segregation that are not going to respond to fiscal and social policy reform. Now, just to put a little bit in context, what happens in Mexico during a recession, during the Great Recession, the last one we had, and we're not sure we're out of that, But consumption fell in Mexico 3 times more than in the United States. And it just happens that when there's a recession in Mexico, the fall in consumption is very large. And that's not only recessions, but when people lose a job or when they face a difficult time at family, the loss in consumption can be very large. So, and that's what Social Security is supposed to do to protect people against that. This table, I'll direct you to the last line. This is the tax wedge, the difference between the cost of keeping a job for an employer and the money pocketed by the individual. Low-income workers pay in Mexico an average of 15%. High-income workers pay an average of 35%. And in the next few months, I think we're going to see a lot of discussion on this in Mexico. Very likely the new government that is coming in a couple of weeks is going to propose a fiscal reform. That's what they've said. And this is going to be at the center of the debate. So in the report, we go deeper into this. Now, one of the issues that has to be discussed and learned, and other papers deal with this also, is that to a large extent, at least in urban areas, this is an issue of micro firms. Okay, at the bottom left, you see the share of people covered by Social Security. In large firms, coverage is above 90%. So it's pretty universal. Even in small, medium firms, say firms between 11 and 50, 100 workers, coverage is above 70%. And the big issue is the micro firms, independent employers. And there the issue is not only that coverage is below 10%, but it has been falling. Coverage now for that segment of the labor market is lower than 5 years ago. So there we have an issue. Now, human capital has to play a role in this debate. By the time NAFTA began around the mid-90s, 2/3 of the Mexican labor force had only elementary education or less. 2/3. That has improved, but still there's a big lag in education. And obviously, small firms have many of these low education people. Now, it's not an issue of a stagnating economy. Here we have some graphs on the dynamics of job relocation in the country. This is a very dynamic labor market. There's a lot of job creation, destruction, of creation of new firms, movement of firms across the country. We have some analysis on how countries have relocated with NAFTA, mainly between the U.S. and Mexico, but also certainly Canada. And there are issues, and issues are significant. I only would like to say that you can find the reports and the papers in the web page of this project. And we're going to be having in the next few weeks also papers on health insurance reform, on pension reform, on fiscal reform, all of them related to jobs and social protection. Okay? And I think my 5 minutes are basically up. Thank you very much.
So good morning, and thank you for the IDRC for inviting us to this event. So Samuel talked about I'm sorry, I always use Mac. Okay, so Samuel talked about a long-term relationship between employment, growth, employment, social security, and social protection. And basically in this research, we wanted to focus on the stylized facts of the labor market in Mexico across the business cycle, during the business cycle. And you will see in a few slides why this is very important for us. This research basically continues previous research that we have done at the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. In our previous research, we focus on cycles and formal employment behavior. And we expanded that research in basically 4 areas. First, we analyzed not only formal employment, but labor force participation, employment, unemployment, formal employment, and informal employment, which is very important in Mexico. Second, we analyzed not only total employment, but employment across age groups. Third, we analyzed these indicators across firm size. And finally, we also analyzed wages. The paper is full of details, basically, because we wanted to focus on identifying stylized facts. Here I will just go over a few findings, basically. So why we are so interested in these economic cycles? Well, you can see in this graph that Mexico has suffered 3 important economic crises in the last 18 years. The first one is the 94-95, the tequila crisis. This is a very local crisis, affected Mexico and other few countries in Latin America. And basically, the percentage change of GDP from the peak of the cycle to the trough was 9%. The second was the crisis of the 2000-2002, when the percentage change of the GDP from the peak to trough was 4%. And the last one was the Great Recession of 2008-2009, where the change of the GDP was 10%. So this is very, very important. What happened with formal employment? Basically, if you see the behavior of the GDP growth and the behavior of the formal employment growth, before and after the trough of the cycle, you see that when the economy was recovering, at least in 2002 and less obvious in 1995, employment did not recover at the same pace. And when we started to do this with research, we didn't have data for the last recession. So we were very concerned about this phenomena of jobless recovery, which was more or less presented in the recession of the 2000-2002, as you can see in the green graph. The dotted lines are the GDP, and the solid lines are the employment. So we were very concerned about this. What was the difference between one recession and the other? And basically, we wanted to understand these stylized facts along the economic cycle. And since I don't have a lot of time, I just want to say that basically what we did, we just calculate what was the difference between the employment at the peak of the cycle and the employment and the current employment or the employment in every quarter or that we have data to analyze what was the employment gaps. And we did for the age groups, for the firms, and everything. And basically, what we encountered was that during the last crisis, for example, all the employment gap is explained by the young population, and a little bit by the elderly. So, thank you very much, and I think I'm done. Thank you.
For some reason this is in Spanish. No problem. No problem. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. We want to thank IDRC's and CIDA's support for this project. This was fundamental. It's a very long paper, so I'm gonna do my best to be very brief. What was it about and what we found. The question that we were trying to solve was, there has been, unfortunately, an increase in poverty in Mexico during the last 3 or 4 years. This was like a breaking trend compared to the previous 12 or 14 years, so it's really bad news. So what has driven this increase in poverty? It has been very well documented that for the poorest in Mexico, it is like price-driven, in the sense, especially the increases in food prices play like a critical role. However, if you go to the second quintile, people that are between the 20th and 40% in the income distribution, prices cannot explain that. So the hypothesis that we were trying to explore is to what extent this has been job-driven. And we use a new methodology that worked pretty well, and I have to thank Professor Albert Berry from University of Toronto and CIEP programmers for developing a very nice algorithm to match data. Mexico has like 2 very nice surveys. On the one hand, you have an income expenditure survey with very, very detailed data about income and expenditures, but with very poor data about jobs. On the other hand, we have a job survey that has a lot of details for job information, but it's not good in terms of income and expenditures. So the methodology that we developed cope with trying to put together these 2 databases. And we found things that we consider that are very interesting. On the one hand, there was a general deterioration. But like Professor Albert Berry says, well, maybe this is not news. If you have like a big crisis in 2008 and 2009, you should expect to have a general deterioration. So the interesting part is which groups were specifically very, very hurt. And we found 3 groups, and this worries us very much. On the one hand, youngsters, especially young people, and this is very aligned with what Gordon and Sam were telling. Even though they have skills, or much more skills than previous generations, they are not able to find like good jobs. On the second hand, and this is very bad news for poverty, women in rural areas. They were very, very hurt. We don't know exactly what happened. There are some very interesting hypotheses that relate migration, men coming back to the country, but there has been a very strong deterioration for jobs for women in rural areas. And the third group, and this really came as a surprise, is older men. Older men. And if you have done work in labor economics and you do like the typical Minserian equations, we are very used like to have the experience premium. In Mexico, this is evaporating. It's disappearing, especially for men. We believe that this will have very, very important policy implications in terms of pensions, retiring ages, and what will happen in the Mexican labor markets. Coping strategies of the population. What we have found, people are working more hours. Sometimes they try to compensate that. And the other phenomenon is that now much more family members are working. So if you have like the typical average of 2, now it's jumping a lot. So basically there's more people in the labor market, but with worse conditions. Now, we believe that Mexico is in a transition, like a middle upper income country. I mean like upper middle. Nonetheless, if we want to sustain a vibrant middle class, labor markets will play a critical role. It seems, with the characterization that we have now of our labor markets, it is going to be very hard for this to happen. So these claims to develop good policies, and I think that the new government will have a lot of challenges in this area.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. My presentation deals with productivity, particularly in small firms. And I want to start, this is not the, I want to start putting the PowerPoint. Let me mention as a background that we posit that Mexico has a very, very rich data in terms of what we were referring to. Samuel mentioned that Chile had some interesting data about firms, and we found out that one of the richest, if not the only one in the world, was was done in Mexico. We discovered that the Mexican economic census is one of the very, very few census in the world that has registered for all establishments, even if they are less than 10 workers in a firm. So that doesn't happen, for example, in Chile. And that's a very important difference because, say in Mexico, we found out that 48% of the workers are in firms that are with less than 10 workers, 11 workers. And the value added in these small firms of the whole economy is not more than 15%. And there are some other stylized facts which are very, very interesting in this data set. But I would claim that there is a unique feature in this data set that will help us to have this additional information that we were trying to find out to get some policy lessons for other Latin American countries and some related similar countries in the world, which is the following fact. As Nelly had pointed out, Mexico went through a very pronounced recession in 2009. And an interesting thing about this is that the economic census was done for the year 2008. So for the whole economy, and for each firm in the economy, we have a large questionnaire that was answered by each firm. So for some peculiar reason, not related necessarily with this study, the National Institute of Statistics decided to go 6 months after the questionnaire was applied to see if a very large representative sample of small firms were still there. I mean, just the question was, we want to have a directory actualized. We think they thought there were a lot of firms closing down. So they went at the end of 2009 and just found out which firms closed down permanently. And for us, that was the kind of question we wanted to, or any economist or any social scientist would like to have, is to go from the picture where we know exactly what kind of firm is being registered in the census, to do a little film, a little movie, and see what happens in these 6 months, right? Why? Because all the questions that, or most of the questions that are relevant for understanding if resource reallocation. I would even say that if there is a key point of the world development point is that this Schumpeterian concept of job creation should not only be concentrated on productivity. I think today I must say that Professor Gordon Betcherman's insightful interpretation of the World Bank, it's really what we need to focus. I mean, these firms which have a greater social value than the private social value, if they have spillovers, if they connect to world markets, if there is more social cohesion with this set of firms, however they are defined, right? Then we need to go to the movie, right? 6 months later or 1 year later, see which firms close down. where the resources, the allocation of these jobs went to other type of small firms, which are socially an improvement. And that we have it with this data set. So in addition to going to follow up 300,000 establishments, which is a 10% representative sample of the census, they also had a representative sample of the geographic zones in the country, and they register new establishments in a period of 6 months. So what we got as a number of results is that along with a lot of establishments that closed down permanently, almost 5.5% of them closed down. We are talking of small firms defined as less than 100 workers, mostly are less than 50. So along with that process, a large percentage of firms were also started, even if it was a recession. So it's telling us about a very interesting and inefficient a dynamic process of resource reallocation, and we want to find out if they went to the most productive, if the ones that closed down, which characteristics they had. So we had an elaborate paper which is available to you. I have some copies. It's a large paper, but we basically wanted to focus on determining the relationship between the job destructions at the margin and the job creations that this little movie can allow us to understand. What are the characteristics, especially related to some index of resource disallocation. And we wanted to see which were the characteristics of the firms that closed down. And for that, we had a very rich data with the census, and we know what were the characteristics of credit access of these firms, and which were the characteristics of paying severance money to workers that were released. And we want to go to this process of trying to understand what is the policy implications in terms of the overall policy framework. And one of the cases, one of the points we will raise for the Mexican economy is that when a policymaker is thinking that they should put resources to try to keep small firms open, they should think that there is this dynamic process, and if a firm is closing but resource being allocated to another type of establishment, another type of firms, then if this is within the allocative efficiency we are seeking for a sustained growth with more social cohesion, then we should not try to stop that. We should rather see the overall framework and see if the employment protection is helping us, or if it's rather releasing the process. For example, shall we move towards a more safety net type of things where workers can cope with this, the implications in social costs of this process, but at the same time, it's part of what's required to move them from one kind of sector or establishment activity to another one, which is more conducive towards sustained development. And I just wanted to mention that we also have another section where we analyze what happens with the productivity and the dynamic process of very large firms, which ironically, there are very, very few, but the value add that they produce is a very, very large percentage in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much to our Mexican colleagues for that very interesting introduction to the Mexican case study. And although you had to be brief, I think it certainly whetted our appetite for learning more and being able to read more about the case study. We've now got about a half an hour for questions. We have a couple of mics set up around the room. We're also webcasting this, and so I'm going to try and remember to look at the screens. For your questions, if you can just gather at the microphones, and if you can just state who you are and your affiliation, and if you can keep some of your questions in your comments brief so we can allow various people to ask some questions. So we're having the usual moment of shyness. Nobody wants to ask the first question. Good. Rodney.
I also, Rodney Schmidt from the North-South Institute, I also am shy, but I'm hoping there will be spillover effects if I come and ask my question first. Thank you very much for that presentation of the World Development Report. I found it very interesting. I'm very impressed at how you were able to draw a storyline through all the data, the operation of different labor markets in different kinds of countries. It's a mammoth job, and I think you've done a very good job. At the beginning of the presentation, there was a discussion of a new perspective on, a new take on development, if you will, seeing jobs as the new center or core or grid through which we can view development. And I was struck by the idea that from a labor market, I'm not a labor market economist, but from the labor market perspective, we are asked no longer to look at jobs as derived demand, but look at jobs as the center of development, as the central channel through which all the various factors and forces that yield development will occur. And what that brought to mind to me was we have development strategies at various levels, right? We have a macroeconomic development strategy. It could be investment-led growth. It could be export-led growth. Now we have a new respectability to what's called industrial policy, which is also a growth strategy, but focusing on the industrial sector where the government intervenes to select, if you will, certain industries or certain sectors. So what I was listening for through all the presentations was a new labor market. I don't want to say labor market policy because that refers to policies to ensure the smooth functioning of the labor market. But I'm searching for a terminology that is similar to what we mean by industrial policy, where the government might intervene and select certain industries or certain types of employment that will yield spillover effects in the labor market into the rest of the economy and to development. And I'm not sure if I quite got that. I'm not sure if I quite understood which kinds of labor that you view as having the big spillover effects. Is it labor that is demanded by firms which have foreign investment? Is it labor that is accessible to youth, for example? I'm not sure if I quite got that. And as a flip side to that, the policies that are being recommended, it's really interesting that you say many of them will not necessarily be labor market policies. They might be urbanization. They might be other policies that facilitate exports. In that case, what's the difference between a labor market policy or a labor-centered, a job-centered view of development and a growth strategy, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions and then come back to our panel. John.
Thank you very much. I'm John Sinclair. I used to work with CIDA and the World Bank for some time, but now I suppose I'm in a more flexible role of life, working with Ottawa University and with the North-South Institute as one of their associates. I wanted really to pick up a little bit, in some senses, of the same themes that Rodney was talking about, but more importantly, what Gordon was talking about in terms of quality jobs and the implications of what we mean by that. I've just come back from living in the last 2 years in Indonesia, and I'm not really going to talk about Indonesia, but I'm going to talk about what I'm seeing or was seeing in the realities of emerging economies in that part of the world, which were on this wonderful wave of growth and growing employment and growing everything else. And they're now confronted by the current global economic crisis, which concerns us all now, mainly in the North, originating certainly in the North, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, but has now come to infect them. Now, and I was curious, what are the implications for this in terms of, if you want to call it a coping strategy around jobs in this part of the world? I mean, if you look at the growth of Asia, Southeast Asia, it has been creating a wonderful array of new and exciting jobs for everybody under the sun. And the examples have spread into South Asia, the example given of Bangladesh. But there's now a lot of discussion of a different type of coping structure, which is strategy, which is to sort of look inwards, to turn almost, I would say, to turn your back on the implications of globalization for growth, and to say we have to have a different type of job structure, a different type of employment strategy. I mean, Gordon was hinting at it in terms of the comments about what is happening in China, but what is happening in China is maybe a larger example of what is happening in many other countries, including Indonesia. So what is the perspective of the panel, in a sense, on how do you cope with a shrinking global economy, a stagnant global economy in terms of the job marketplace? One where you don't have this buoyancy. I mean, the Mexican situation is a tragic example of the similar type of sort of collateral impact, which is hardly collateral. It's drastically affecting the country. So what is the implication for that? Are we looking for different types of employment strategies, different types of jobs? I mean, one of the assumptions, one of the discussion points is that when we have an economy driven by export-orientated production, you have a particular type of labor market, a particular type of skill set, and that if part of the coping mechanisms to turn inward to produce more for your domestic marketplace, then maybe the types of employment creation we're talking about will be very different. So what is the views of the panel, in a sense, on coping with the dismal world economy of today?
Those are two pretty big questions. So how about we go to our panel to see some responses to those questions, and then we'll go for another round. Thanks.
Thank you. The first question, I will try to give an answer to the first question, and I give the answer with another question, which is not very polite, but it's something we've done in certain other occasions. That is what we call difficult question number one. What is the difference between a growth strategy and a job strategy? When you call for something of policy recommendations that yields spillovers, we basically say, know your challenge and try to come up with a job strategy. So the report doesn't provide clear answers and basically, or very precise answers to this type of question, basically hints to where the answers may be. And when we had this slide showing the pyramid or the lens with several types of jobs for every kind of category, we're kind of hinting, perhaps if you are a conflict-afflicted country, you need to find jobs for violent youth and preventing them for participating in conflict. Or even if it is not an open war, even if it is criminality or things like that, this is a very peculiar, specific challenge that you have to face, and you have to come up with the policies. What the policies are may depend from one country to another, from a war-inflicted country to a crime-driven region or something like that. But I think what is even goes beyond these very specific policy recommendations is our discussion about job strategies or growth strategies. And that is difficult question number one. And basically, the conventional answer was, you grow. And if you grow, you will have the jobs. And the economists usually tend to measure this with the famous Okun's coefficient. So this much you grow, this many jobs you get. And the report basically documents that when Okun coefficients have been computed, they change from one country to another widely, and they change within the country from one period to another widely. So you cannot expect that this close relationship is what you are going to get. First thing. Second thing, in some cases you grow and you get the jobs, and in the medium and long term, jobs are mostly associated to your demographics. Most people work, but not precisely or not necessarily in the kind of jobs and the kind of activities that you want with high value added or higher earnings, or the kind of jobs that reduce poverty or enhance civic engagement. So this is basically our stock taking that says, listen, yes, this is important, but perhaps it's not enough. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And then we go to the idea that if we believe that these spillovers are important, we basically have what we call a measurement problem. If we were able, with our value-added computations, to take into consideration all the external value that taking care of the environment adds to the welfare of a society. Or all the additional value that intergenerationally is created because women participate in the labor market, and therefore there's more investment in nutrition and in general benefits for the children. Those are long-term benefits that you don't see in your annual value-added computations. So if we were able to measure all those things together, a growth strategy and a job strategy would be the same, because we will have full accounting of the welfare benefits of every single activity that we have. But we don't. We don't measure all these things properly. So that leads us to say, okay, you have to take into consideration this thing. All economists and social scientists understand that there are these spillovers that are not very perfectly measured. Actually, in many cases, we have no idea of what's going on with these things. So we have to take into consideration these things and put them as clear objectives of what you want to do when you are promoting your growth strategies, promoting your growth, your economic growth policies. And that finalizes, this section finalizes with a consideration of what is being happening in very successful countries like Singapore and Korea. Singapore is a country that has been tremendously successful. But we tend to forget that in the early 60s, shortly after independence, it was a country that focused on labor markets and focused on having housing for the workers, having a working city, actually this is a big city, and having a city that is able to become a humongously successful commercial entrepot. So for them it was fundamental that you have to create jobs, and Singapore in those times had very high unemployment rates, racial riots, ethnic problems. They address all those issues in order to be able to grow rapidly. And after these things were somehow solved, they enter into this high growth pattern of. Now, think of an opposite case, Korea. Very recently, Korea has adopted a job strategy for 2015 to 2020. And it's a strategy that is not based on growth. It's based on how to increase youth labor participation, female labor participation, and seniors labor participation to avoid that high-skilled seniors retire and the productivity drive of the society is somehow tapered off. So this is, and the interesting thing is that they abandoned central planning and growth strategies several years ago, and now they've decided to have a job strategy for Korea, which is a very successful country. And the job strategy is not sitting in the labor ministry. It's sitting in the finance ministry. So for this is central. This is a country that's been successful in terms of development and now realizes that jobs are fundamental, that what's going on with the labor conditions of the labor force of the population is fundamental. So we don't have a full answer, or this is your recipe given your characteristics in order to have a good job strategy. But we're basically trying to hint, listen, look at these cases and notice that because of our limitations in terms of measurement and the experiences that some very successful countries are having in terms of taking into consideration what's happening with the population and how they insert in the labor market is an interesting idea that we should add to our conventional growth strategy and go for growth. It's beyond that. It's a little bit more than that. But I encourage you to read I think we really want the audiences to read this and think about these issues. We don't have full answers. We basically try to hint to new ideas. Gordon?
Okay. First of all, I think that the Mexican team may well have some interesting ideas on this, because you gave the example of Indonesia, and we just heard a presentation from Mexico about the stagnation caused from the global crisis and how it's affected Mexico. And I think one of the interesting, Gabriel started with the question about why is formal social protection so narrowly diffused in Mexico, and I think that's where I'm going to wind up in my remarks here, but I look forward to comments that the Mexican team can offer to here. But, regardless of the global economic context, the report really starts with the notion that jobs are critical for transforming living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. So that's really the starting point, regardless of what the environmental context is. And we haven't had enough time to get into a lot of the details, and if you have time, read this thing. There are difficult trade-offs between pursuing living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. They often don't march in lockstep, and that's often when you need a jobs strategy rather than just a growth strategy. And those trade-offs become more difficult to work out in times of slow economic growth. Things that might help living standards may well be detrimental to productivity. You may want to focus on social cohesion at the expense of living standards and productivity, and those difficult trade-offs become more acute during slow global economic times. But I don't think it changes the basic strategy that the report argues for, which is that, first of all, that the fundamentals are very important. So you talked about Indonesia starting to consider approaches that would have them looking inward. And without knowing the details of the recent debates in Indonesia, I would say that that doesn't really bode well, because we do see a lot of growth coming from an outwardly oriented economy. And there's a lot in the report about the benefits of learning from global knowledge and the agglomeration effects of being part of a bigger economy. So looking inward probably wouldn't be a good starting point as far as the report would consider. The second thing would be that for a country like Indonesia, which is at a stage of development where formal social protection instruments are in play, this would probably be an important issue in the current context, just as it is in the Mexican context. And again, pointing to one of the difficult questions, we have a question in the report which is called protecting workers or protecting jobs. And what we try to, the conventional wisdom here is that you should protect workers. And by that, we mean give workers the tools to retool and to get whatever income support they need during a period when they're not working. For a middle-income country like Indonesia, though, there may be at times when job creation opportunities are just not there. That's a time when social protection policies that can help protect jobs in the short run may in fact be a useful thing to do too. And this is something that runs against conventional wisdom in terms of policy in that area. So two things that I would emphasize really here would be the paying attention to the fundamentals more than ever at a time when global economic growth is slow. And second of all, thinking through social protection and maybe thinking about non-conventional solutions that will help weather the crisis. May not be a recipe for the long term, but would help countries weather the crisis. Do you guys have anything to add on this?
Well, given that this Mexico study has to do with social protection and the labor market, there were a series of consultations and seminars, and you can find some of these on the internet on people discussing this issue. And well, these are difficult issues, but I'd like to say briefly one message that perhaps one can draw. How growth and government industrial policy affects employment is a hard topic, and some people is more convinced of what to do and what not to do. On the other hand, we also have the issues of social regulation that are related but are not the same. I'm not sure governments know a lot about how to deal or how to avoid recessions. I'm not sure governments know that. But I think governments know much more about how to do good regulations on health insurance or pension insurance. Just to give you an example, as part of all this work, we found out that nobody really knows in Mexico what social programs are available. Nobody has been able to draw the list. You know, it's one of it has happened in the U.S. I do not know if I can say Canada, but the government has thousands of programs at the federal, at the state, at the municipal level, And nobody is able to come out with a list of the programs, of the money the government is spending. That's the way it is. And I think it's a bad regulation. I think the government could do much better with having some pension reform and some health reform. I'm not sure if that's going to solve the growth or the recession problem, but I think we can do a lot in terms of improving, for example, the pension system. And we also follow that road a little bit in all these additional papers I mentioned. Again, even those issues are not simple. I mean, tell me about health insurance is a very complex issue, and but there's a lot that can be done to improve that, and we also follow those arguments.
Let me start by mentioning that if I could extend the idea of spillover, because perhaps spillover, the way we tend to understand it is like what's the spillover of internet in other firms or something that affects the cost or the efficiency of other firms. I think an initial point of departure is that in countries, as it is the case of Mexico or the India that we know that the estimations had been done, is that there is an heterogeneity in firms within very narrowly defined sectors. You can tell, say, shoemaking or whatever activity it is, you can find a very efficient firm next to a very inefficient one. So the dispersion one tends to find in countries such as in Mexico, India, or other countries where this kind of analysis has been done is very, very large. Therefore, we should change our thinking, if that's the case, that the problem of Mexico or India is to catch up with the technological frontier, to catch up with what is the best way to do things, right? The real challenge is how to catch up within the very, very narrow industries, right? How would a small firm which is next to the other one can catch up with the other one, which is doing things twice as efficient, which is having better jobs and more stable jobs. I think that's the first main message that I would think that this kind of study tells us. Due to the large heterogeneity of ways of doing things within small firms in very narrowly defined products or service production, then the term spillovers should come like saying, how do we do this, right? And the other one is, we should also think of why small firms, right, don't grow, right? We should see, can we have these spillovers from firms that succeed in growing and giving better jobs or more stable ones? Can we have the spillovers into the ones that are starting? Because we talk a lot, and I also agree with that, about the social cost for the worker. We should also think of the social cost of a number of workers who try to put some very minor capital together to be self-employed or a small firm, and it closes down. So we would like them to not to close down, but to try to grow. So these two perspectives, I think, from this kind of study, is the kind of message we would like to transmit, at least in my case.
We are going to go to a second round of questions. We're starting to get close to time, so again, I ask that your comments and questions be brief. And John, you're going to have to wait, and we'll get a couple of others.
Minor clarification.
Okay, but let's get some other points. I'm going to start over here, and then we'll move over. Thanks.
I'm Nipa Banerjee. I'm with the University of Ottawa, School of International Development. I'm teaching there. My question was a little bit, I'm interested in spillover effects on development for job creation and some of the issues that Gordon mentioned, as well as in various countries, depending on the country context, the types of job creation you could do. For instance, in conflict countries, ex-combatants, jobs for ex-combatants. In my research, I found an interesting thing, and I wanted to ask you, what was your methodology? Other than looking at jobs from macro point of view, did you have any surveys or discussions with people in some of the countries, in the various country contexts? I found something very interesting in my research in Islamic countries. Women, definitely job creation for women helps, as Gordon and many of you have mentioned, helps in the spillover. What I found that some anthropologists talking to the women in Islamic countries, they found that women think that there should be more jobs created for men, because if women earn more income, it creates more discord and conflict in the society. When the men don't have jobs and women have jobs, it creates more problems. So my question to you was that, did you go and survey and talk to people? And especially on the spillover effects like the social cohesion issue, or when women get jobs, what happens?
Thank you. Francisco?
The question for Nelly Aguilera. I am Francisco Cos from IDRC. You finished your presentation with a conclusion that the youth were the big losers in the last recession in Mexico, a point that also was touched by Héctor Villarreal. Could you expand a little bit more? How did it manifest, and what were your findings regarding the causes why the youth lost more?
My name is Hilary Clausen. I work with CIDA. I gather that informal sector jobs can drive development just as much as formal. I'm wondering if that is because they are informal or in spite of them being informal, and further what the government role might be in the informal sector, whether we would want them into the formal or to remain informal.
Great. Over to our panel. Who would like to start?
Regarding the question of Francisco, yes, I mean, in these 5 minutes, we didn't have time to go deeply in the results, but basically what we have found is that basically the young population, people aged 14 to 19 and 20 to 24, because we measure brackets, show a gap in December 2011 with respect to the peak of the cycle. And basically was the group of people that amounted to the largest amount of people losing, or not participating in the not having employment. But something that we are going and doing now is that we have seen that in Mexico, a lot of these people is already studying, which is good. I mean, the high school expansion in the last 10 years has been very big. So probably these people, we really don't know why they are not employed. Some of them are employed in the informal sector, but some of them are already out of the labor force studying. So it's a research that we're doing now. But basically, we think that some of these persons who already have left the school some years ago, they are not going back to school. So basically, we need to help them to start a new career in some firms or something with youth programs for them.
Well, I only would like to make a brief comment on this formal-informal issue. I think it's a very good question. Look, one of the issues here is what does society expect from social protection? One of the big issues is what does it mean to be informal? Is it an issue to have a small company without the boss? I don't think nobody cares about those issues. But well, in Mexico, as in, I guess in definitely in all developed countries and in, let's say, in all of Latin America and many other regions, when we have informal economy, we also have a very defective pension system, a very defective health insurance system. Just to give perhaps the biggest example now in Mexico, the government that is going to end in a couple of weeks basically says that there's a universal health insurance in Mexico now. Now, it's not the first time it happens. It happened also in the 90s. Another government came out and said, I already achieved universal health insurance in Mexico. And the question is, what's health insurance? What does it mean to have people into health insurance? At the end, I believe one of the big issues for the government now is that the bread and butter issues of health insurance, self-selection, moral hazard are happening. The government does not have money to pay the services the way they are working. Many people who should be paying is not paying. Many people who should be receiving support is not receiving support because the government does not have money. Those issues have to be faced. And that's why I mentioned we have to think more seriously about the regulation issues. I don't know if we can solve the whole growth, poverty problems, but I think we can do much better in terms of, for example, regulating health insurance. We have Mexico has this problem that is very common when you have a segmented labor market. People is not sure of who is going to provide hospital service at the end. I may be an affiliate to the Social Security Institute, but at the end, the queues are too large, and maybe when I need it, I have to go to a private doctor. And then I may not be paying health insurance, but then if I get cancer, then I can come in through the back door and who knows, maybe get some service. And those issues have to be solved. Perhaps leave behind some of the issues of employment protection and growth, and get directly into the regulation issues of pensions and health and families.
Very fast. I think it's a very good question, and I would like to complement just Gabriel's point in one or two issues. I believe that informal jobs have been a good escape valve for poor people, and these ultra-flexible markets help to do like arbitrage for very specific things. Nonetheless, with exceptions, mostly they are bad jobs. And we need to be very careful because there's a semantic problem. Sometimes people bundle social policy with jobs policies. Or if we believe that by giving social policy to informal people, it will become a productive job, I think that will be very misleading. So that will be very good maybe in terms of equality. However, and as a good social policy. However, if we are expecting these jobs become productive, we have to take care about infrastructure, capital, and a lot of issues that are now missing.
Very briefly, in order to address your questions, we relied on nearly 55 background papers that we commissioned for the research on certain topics, specific topics, addressing the issues of youth violence, rights, employment triggers of poverty reduction. So all those background papers are available for researchers in the website of the World Development Report. In addition, we also provide all the micro data sets of 2 micro data sets that we commission. Why? One is the FAFO, which Norwegian Development Agency sponsored, which is a micro data set in 4 small, medium-sized villages, one in Colombia, in China, in Egypt, and in Sierra Leone. And in those surveys, we make a large array of questions in order to compute hedonic wages. So researchers can figure out the trade-offs of that are implicit in the answers of people regarding earnings and certain benefits. And in one of the presentations that we made, in some cases when we have more time, I'm sorry for that, but for instance, we have this question, we have a pair of questions that we ask to people. What is the job, and we give a list of occupations that is more valuable to the town, what is more valuable to the whole society. And no doubt, in all of these 4 countries, people tend to say the doctor or the teacher. But then the second question is, what is the job that you would like to have yourself and that you value most? And people either want to be civil servants or have a small trade activity. So that is kind of a hint of this difference between the social value of a job and the private value of a job. And people make clear differences about this. So that was one of the data sources that we use for developing this idea, in addition to all these background papers. And let me conclude saying that all these background papers and the microdata are available in the website of the World Development Report. You can download it and do your own research if you're interested in it. We also made a collection of nearly 600 household surveys worldwide, and we curated and harmonized all these surveys and run our estimates, for instance, of firm dynamics or our own estimates of labor force participation. And all that information is available. I mean, these microdata sets, the FAFO microdata set, and another one that we collected, which is the ILO October Inquiry Survey, which is curated by Richard Freeman and co-authors with a new methodology to make comparisons about the average earnings worldwide. And in addition, we also have this, which is the Jobs Knowledge Platform, which is an initiative from the World Bank that includes background papers, blogs, and even videos on related to the discussions about job research, research related to job markets, be it to the World Development Report or worldwide. So at the same time, the report is trying to give a strong message of the need of collecting more data, the need of pursuing additional research on the lines of the World Development Report in order to address the job challenges of the world. Thank you. That is what I wanted to say. But if more details are needed, I'm happy to explain to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful pointer to the future, but sadly we do have to bring this morning's event to a close. And for that, I'd like to introduce Professor Marcel Mérette. He is a professor of economics, but he is also Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa, and he'll provide some closing remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sue. I would like first to congratulate the speakers. I think to summarize such a huge and I believe also important reports in such a way is fantastic. I think we have learned a lot this morning. I would like to also to congratulate the IDRC for the format of this session this morning. We had in the first part general trends, overview of the report, and then context specific to Mexico. And this reflects pretty much one of the messages, important messages of the report, that there is overall trends review, but also we need to take into consideration local context. I guess we all understood that this report is much a lot beyond the usual, labor demand and supply, labor supply in a famous diagram where there is a cross intersection and there is a wage and a quantity of labor. We'll go much more beyond that. And this is actually somewhat, I believe, a controversial and challenging report. Of course, in all those world development reports, we do find a lot of facts, a lot of data, a lot of information. There is a large amount of work behind this report. But very rapidly, we go beyond this, and we are challenging the conventional wisdoms. So, of course, in that report, we do find, for instance, from Samuel, we learned that, of course, challenges are huge in the future in terms of creation, in terms of growth. We learned a lot about the different facts with respect to the labor market in different regions of the world. But and also we were told that number of jobs matters, but also the quality of jobs matters. This is the kind of thing that we probably would expect. But very, very rapidly we go beyond this, and he told us, for instance, that labor policy matters much less than we think. So this is very challenging. If I'm not a labor economist, but I'm happy not to be a labor economist this morning. It's not so crucial than we think of. We also learned that, jobs drives development. That's a kind of statement. This is a very challenging statement. And of course, the conventional wisdom is just the opposite. You focus on development, at the end you get creation of jobs. So we are trying to inverse that statement. And this is, of course, very challenging. When Samuel was referring to part one, jobs are, the title of the part one, jobs are transformational. Jobs transforms the economy and transforms society. And again, so this is not the end result. This is not the target at the end. You can use jobs to transform your economy and your society. When we're talking about poverty, when we're talking about productivity, but also social cohesion. So this is big. So this is much beyond again, the standard diagram than we used to think of. Gordon didn't go even further, referring to part 2 and part 3 of the report. So Gordon has used, for instance, statements like, the best labor policy may be outside the labor market. Again, we go outside. We have to go outside the famous diagram. He's talking about jobs as a social rather individual concept. So we are thinking more in terms of social issue when we talk about jobs, rather than individuals issue. In terms of policy, again, there are different layers in terms of policy. So they are he refers to fundamentals. Of course, we were somewhat expecting something like that. The second layer is labor policy, and again, we were told that that maybe not be the most important ones. And finally, priorities. It's important to know very well your local context if you want to get some results with respect to jobs. Another very strong statement. There are many others, but Gordon took the example of jobs, skill versus jobs. We used to think that you should develop skills and then you would get develop, create jobs, and so on. That may not be the case everywhere. And I think when we had the presentation from our colleagues from Mexico, Gabriel, Nelly, Hector, and Angel, they show us at some point, that local context matters. And when we think about skill versus jobs, that could be more difficult issue than we think of. So we heard about Mexico, that education is an issue. Mexico has a big economic cycles. Women in rural areas matters, older men, and productivity in small firms, and so on. So I don't know if I want to summarize the report and presentation this morning. Of course, it's very attractive to use the word jobs, like the title of the report, by the way. But I think it's much more than that. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's transformation. I don't know if it's institution. I don't know if it's development in general. But one thing is sure, there is a lot in that report to think about. It's challenging a lot of views, and I think we have to congratulate all the authors on that. And I think I encourage you to read it. I do feel that I'm much more interested to read it than ever. And I think there is something. Maybe there is a second tome coming about what we should call it. Jobs as a center. What is this new strategy of development we should think about when we will look at this after reading this report? So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and this morning's session is now closed. Thanks very much for attending.